Tensions continue to mount in the South China Sea as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth this weekend called for increased military buildup in the contested waters to confront China. This comes as Philippine and US forces kick off their second set of joint military exercises in the Philippines in just 1 month. We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. A major escalation in the U.S. war on China and academia. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced Wednesday in a statement, under President Trump's leadership, the U.S. State Department will work with the Department of Homeland Security to aggressively revoke visas for Chinese students, including those with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or studying in critical fields. We will also revise visa criteria to enhance scrutiny of all future visa applications from the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong. Experts noted the damage this could do to both U.S.-China cultural exchange and scientific and technological research, as the CPC has nearly 100 million members, and most Chinese universities are affiliated with the party in some way. This will also have a major impact on higher education and U.S. universities, which have come to rely on international students' tuition to help offset providing financial aid to Americans. About 277,000 Chinese international students studied in the U.S. last year, making them the second largest group of foreign students in the U.S. after students from India. On that note, China has stepped up and issued unconditional offers to international students at Harvard amid the university's ongoing conflict with the Trump administration. In late May, Trump revoked Harvard's ability to enroll international students, leaving foreign students with the choice of transferring to other universities or losing their legal status. However, a judge on Friday placed a temporary restraining order on the ban, allowing Harvard to continue enrolling international students for now. Hong Kong Education Secretary Christine Choi called on universities in the Chinese financial hub to welcome outstanding students from all over the world. In a statement, Choi said, for international students affected by the United States student admission policy, the Education Bureau has appealed to all universities in Hong Kong to provide facilitation measures for eligible students. The Education Secretary said that universities in Hong Kong were making use of governmental measures, including relaxing the maximum limits on foreign students to attract students to the city. The Hong Kong University of Science and Technology on Friday invited international students at Harvard to continue their studies at the college, stating that it was ready to provide unconditional offers, streamlined admission procedures, and academic support to facilitate its seamless transition for interested students. Indonesia's President Prabowo Subianto has lauded China's long-standing support for anti-colonial struggles and developing nations. Subianto called Beijing a key partner in the pursuit of a safe and prosperous region as Jakarta moves to deepen strategic and economic ties with China. While hosting Chinese Premier Li Qiang in Jakarta on May 24th, Prabowo praised China's record of standing up to imperialism and its backing of Palestinian statehood, an issue that resonates deeply in Indonesia, which is the world's most populous Muslim-majority country. He also stated that China had supported liberation movements even during its own nation-building phase and continued to do so today, citing Beijing's leadership, especially in defending the Palestinian people, as a source of pride for all of us. Prabowo has been quite public in his admiration for China, particularly of late Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, which he has cited as a source of inspiration for his own economic vision. China is Indonesia's biggest trade partner, with annual trade volume between the two countries reaching more than $130 billion US. During their meeting, Prabowo invited Chinese investors to explore opportunities beyond natural resources, such as education, health, tourism, and science. A huge explosion rocked a chemical plant in China's eastern Shandong province last Tuesday, killing at least 5 people and injuring 19. The blast was even powerful enough to knock out the windows at a storage warehouse over 2 miles away from the factory, according to a video shared by a local resident. The explosion happened at the Gaomi Yaodao Chemical Company, which is located in an industrial park in the city of Weifang. It manufactures pesticides as well as chemicals for medical use and has more than 500 employees, according to corporate registration records. Local fire officials sent more than 230 personnel to the scene. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has approved the first Chinese-invented painkiller designed as a non-opioid alternative. Kamzova, developed by a Nanjing-based biotech firm, is the world's first long-acting injectable analgesic, offering 24-hour pain relief through a single daily injection. The non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication belongs to the same group of painkillers as aspirin and ibuprofen and contains a high concentration of meloxicam, a compound commonly used to reduce pain and inflammation. According to Sino Biopharmaceutical, the Chinese firm that owns the commercial rights to Kamzova, clinical trials showed that it was effective in reducing post-surgical reliance on opioids. By providing a safer, long-lasting treatment for moderate to severe pain, Kamzova directly addresses the U.S. overdose epidemic fueled by addictive opioids, including fentanyl, which is linked to tens of thousands of deaths annually. According to the American Psychiatric Association, an estimated 3 to 12% of people treated with opioids for chronic pain will develop addiction or abuse. Sino Biopharm states Kamzova is the best available alternative to morphine, and results from clinical trials published in December showed its use almost halved the use of morphine, as well as reduced patients' pain scores following orthopedic and abdominal surgery. Well, it seems like every few days or so, we see a headline about tensions or clashes in the South China Sea, with regular ship collisions resulting in China and the Philippines blaming one another. And at this past weekend Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth warned against what he called China's aggression and intimidation against its neighbors, calling for increased military buildup in the contested waters. How do we make sense of these tensions, and what role does the Philippines serve in the U.S. containment strategy of China? To discuss this, we are so honored to have on Anna Malindog-Uy. Anna is a geopolitical analyst and columnist for the Manila Times. She's also the Deputy Secretary General for the Association for Philippines-China Understanding, the Vice President for External Affairs at the Asian Century Philippines Strategic Studies Institute, and she's also a PhD candidate in economics at the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development at Peking University. She joins us today from Beijing. Anna, welcome to the China Report.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to your program. It's an honor for me, and it's an opportunity as well to explain issues related to the South China Sea and the last 2025 Shangri-La Dialogue and other related issues. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a real privilege to have you on. I think to start, I'd like to read a quote from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore just this past weekend. The Shangri-La Dialogue is an annual intergovernmental security conference that's hosted by the think tank, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So in his speech in front of representatives from Asia-Pacific countries, Hegseth said, "In the South China Sea, China harasses its neighbors. China seeks to intimidate you in your own waters. These actions reveal a lack of respect for neighbors, and they challenge sovereignty. They challenge freedom of navigation and overflight. We are watching very closely China's destabilizing actions, and any unilateral attempt to change the status quo in the South China Sea and the First Island chain by force or coercion is unacceptable." And as part of his speech, Hegseth also encouraged Asia-Pacific countries to increase their military spending to 5% of GDP to counter China in the South China Sea. So Anna, in the US, typically mainstream media and Washington and think tanks, they usually blame China as the instigator and the aggressor in the South China Sea. And the US, for its part, usually positions itself it usually claims that it maintains a presence there to protect freedom of navigation, to uphold international law, and support its Southeast Asian allies. So I guess to start, the South China Sea is contested waters. Can you explain the basis behind these competing territorial claims, as well as unpack the idea that, the U.S. is just trying to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea, and that China is the bully?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and let me make some comments on U.S. Secretary of Defense Hegseth statement in the 2025 Shangri-La Dialogue with reference to the South China Sea. But I think the most important is to put a framework to all of this by explaining the South China Sea issue a little bit and trying to explain as well the different reference point when you talk about the different claimant states' claims in the South China Sea. But one thing, though, that we have to remember, the South China Sea dispute is highly complex and sensitive geopolitical issue or hotspot characterized by overlapping territorial and maritime claims by China. And there are other claimant states that would include, I think, China, ASEAN states such as the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei. It is this issue of the South China Sea is not necessarily only with China and the Philippines, but it's a regional issue. And there are two related aspects to the South China Sea dispute. The first one is related to contestation when you talk about sovereignty and territorial claims of other claimant states, like, for example, Vietnam and China. And I think even the island of Taiwan has sovereignty or territorial claims over the South China Sea. On the other hand, the other dimension of the dispute is the dimension that some of the claimant states, ASEAN claimant states like Malaysia, the Philippines, and even I think Brunei, their claims is anchored on UNCLOS, and basically it is more about the 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zones. So if you really look at the South China Sea dispute, it revolves around complex overlapping claims among several coastal states. These claims are based again on different reference points. First is historical rights, international treaties like UNCLOS, proximity because of, some, like, for example, the Philippines would claim that, Spratly is quite near to the Philippines. So in a way, they will have it's some kind of geographically near. So logically speaking, it can claim its claim is valid, but actually in international law, it does not hold water. So proximity is one of the issues, I think, and effective occupation and strategic interest, because as you can see in the South China Sea, there are other players from a non claimant state players like the United States coming into this dispute. So when you talk about the different reference point, as I've said earlier, China is more about the 9-line, and then the Philippines is about UNCLOS. But of course, with the backing of the PCA ruling in 2016. And another thing is Vietnam, territorial and historic rights. Malaysia is more on EEZ, or exclusive economic zone, and Brunei is the same. So these are the background to the South China Sea dispute. That if you really look at it, at the moment, if you really look at the issue, it's not easy. It's very complicated. It's highly sensitive. And because of the interference and intervention coming from outside forces like the United States, which are not part of the dispute, it in many ways, and also because of the presence of the military forces of the United States near Taiwan and even near within the South China Sea area, the whole region, the whole sub-region of the South China Sea becomes a flashpoint in Asia Pacific. And when you say a flashpoint, meaning it's a very sensitive geopolitical and military in many ways. So that makes the whole issue being so popular and talked about by countries from different parts of the world. Now, with regard to the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth remarks on the 2025 Shangri-La Dialogue, accusing China of illegally occupying parts of the South China Sea and harassing neighbors, we need to understand this not from a deterrence perspective or language, but through the lens of strategic provocation and power projection. His reaffirmation of U.S. military deployment and joint air exercises signals more than defense. It reflects Washington's attempt to reassert its hegemonic influence in the area, not necessarily only in the South China Sea area, but even in the wider Asia Pacific. So, but one thing that the United States is forgetting, or it does not it does not put out in the public is, first and foremost, it is not a claimant state in the South China Sea. So basically, it doesn't have any kind of authority or even legitimate reasons to be in the South China Sea, especially when you talk about the presence of military forces. Justifying the presence of military forces by saying that it protects or it wants to safeguard freedom of navigation, and by having this EDCA expansion in the Philippines, you have AUKUS, you have the Quad engagement. It's not all about freedom of navigation. It's, I think, more about the containment strategy of the United States against China. It wants to contain China in the Asia Pacific because, as you can see, China is continuously rising. So this is part of the, of the what you call kind of a strategy to paint China in a way that is not good and in a way is negative, because as you can see, China is a big player among the claimant states. So it's easy to use China as the so-called bully in the South China Sea. So that's one thing. And another thing that I think that the United States is forgetting, it is not even signatory to UNCLOS. But in many ways, it actually uses UNCLOS to justify freedom of navigation and its presence in the South China Sea. So that's to be frank with you, it's very hypocritical for the United States to say these things and even to project itself like the peacemaker, when in fact its military presence in the South China Sea and even in the Taiwan Strait make a picture that it actually trying to encircle China in that region.
Mm.
When you talk about U.S. intervention in the South China Sea, it does not really promote peace and stability in the region. Rather, it promotes some kind of complications. Because again, the South China Sea should be resolved by claimant states and party to the conflict. Outside forces make it more complicated if they intervene. And it does not really promote peace and stability and security. It actually destabilizes and provokes many claimant states like China. It's not only about destabilizing the South China Sea region. It also, because of its military presence in the South China Sea, in many ways, it provokes some kind of arms race. Like, for example, China, it feels, I think, that because of the encirclement and because of the containment policy of the United States, it provokes China to upgrade more its military. It also provoked China to conduct more military exercises in the South China Sea, even in the Taiwan Strait. And also, in a way, it encourages China to have more, not only its own military exercises in these areas, but even partnership and some kind of joint military exercises, let us say, with Russia and other of its allied countries, allies in the region. So this is U.S. intervention really is not something. It's not a stabilizing force. It's not even a peace. It does not really promote peace in the region. Rather, it complicates the whole already complicated and very sensitive South China Sea dispute. On the other hand, Hegseth demand for 5% of GDP on defense from Asian countries, or let us say ASEAN countries, but actually he was addressing, I think, all Asian countries, but particularly ASEAN or the Southeast Asian countries, is for me not it's really not a de-escalating strategy, but more of it reflects a militarist kind of escalation. Why would you encourage Asian countries or ASEAN countries to spend 5% of their GDP on military, when in fact, if you look at the South China, if you look at Southeast Asia, and if you look at ASEAN countries and Asian countries, around 2% only of their GDP is being devoted or being allocated to military and defense, precisely because most of the GDP is allocated to health, to their economic development, infrastructure, disaster projects, or disaster management projects, and all of the social welfare kind of programs and projects for these countries, because these are the priorities right now. As far as our region is concerned, Asia and even ASEAN as a sub-region, what we prioritize in our region is not about the militarization of the South China Sea, but rather economic prosperity, economic cooperation, even with China, and also developing of our infrastructure, digital infrastructure, physical infrastructure, trying to address climate change issue and disaster related issues, and these are the things that are important to us, and these are the priorities by which our income or revenue, like for example a part of our GDP would go. So I don't understand why would Hegseth provoke or even encourage ASEAN countries to spend 5% of their GDP on militaries and on military or defense. It's like calling, it's like provoking, or it's like laying ground the situation for Asian countries or ASEAN countries to be bankrupt just because they put more of their GDP on military. And for what? For what purpose? Is there a plan for the United States to provoke some kind of a proxy war or a war in our region? That's why he is encouraging 5%, or is it because the United States wants to sell more arms to countries across the world? Because you know what, my impression of Hegseth with this kind of statement was he was somewhat akin to us, an arms dealer or arms seller, delivering a speech in Singapore with all of with an audience from defense and military of different countries. That's my impression, and also my comment when you talk about this 5% GDP on defense that Hegseth is encouraging countries, not only I think of in Asia, but even in Europe. I think this is already the position of some Western European countries. Yeah.
Yes, I really like the way that you put it, that Pete Hegseth is more of an arms dealer than a government representative. But as part of, I want to turn to the Philippines, like in particular. As part of the campaign to assert its claim over these exclusive economic zones and challenge China, there's been an effort within the country, within the Philippines, to rename part of the South China Sea the West Philippine Sea. The designation has been used by President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., and it's also been picked up by Pete Hegseth himself. And it's even named as such in Google Maps. So can you provide a little bit of context to this campaign? And can you talk about the basis for this campaign?
Yeah, this is a very sensitive question, especially that I am a Filipino, but I would answer the question as far as I'm concerned, in a balanced perspective. So the Philippines already have this name, or the renaming of some parts of the South China Sea as the West Philippine Sea. It is not just a cartographic semantics. It is a deliberate act of political assertion, legal framing, and strategic narrative building. It is a symbolic and diplomatic maneuver aimed at reinforcing the claims of the Philippines in the South China Sea by shaping public consciousness and rallying international support for the Philippines' claim over the South China Sea, especially vis-a-vis China. So what is the Philippine Sea all about and how it came about? The term West Philippine Sea actually was formally adopted through an administrative order number 29 signed by President Benigno Aquino in 2012, which the term actually refers to the western side of the Philippine archipelago, including Luzon Sea, as well as waters around and within the adjacent, what you call Spratly, Kalayaan group of island, but actually it's Spratly in international terms, and also near the Scarborough Shoal. The intention is not necessarily to rename the whole of South China Sea to West Philippine Sea, but actually just to rename a part of the South China Sea within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, which is the basis of its claim in the South China Sea dispute. Now, what is the purpose on the significance of the renaming? When you rename an area, it also signifies it's your claim to that area. So that's basically what the Philippines did when it passed an executive order saying that that part of the South China Sea that the Philippines claims is actually the West Philippine Sea. So the West Philippine Sea serves as a terminological boundary asserting the Philippines' exclusive rights over resources within its exclusive economic zone as far as UNCLOS is concerned. So this is really the intention, I think, behind the Philippine government in 2012 passing an executive order saying that that part is, from now on, we will call it the West Philippine Sea. However, the basic question actually is WPS or the West Philippine Sea legitimate and internationally recognized? Well, if you ask me as a Filipino, and if you ask me technically and legally speaking, based on our domestic laws and legislation, such as the Maritime Zones Act and Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act, and of course the Executive Order number 29 of 2021, within the jurisdiction or the territorial boundary of the Philippines as a sovereign nation state, as far as I am concerned, and I think as far as the Philippine government is concerned, technically and legally speaking, it is legitimate and recognized by Filipino and the Philippine government. But within the boundary, the territorial boundary only of the Philippines, because of the domestic laws that, supports the name WPS. However, the second imperative question is if whether the West Philippine Sea exists under international law or recognized by the wider international and global community. The answer is no. There is no legal entity or officially recognized geopolitical term called WPS in international law, or even or recognized by international community with reference to the South China Sea dispute. Thus far, there is none. WPS is purely a Philippine invention. It's a domestic invention, but it's not internationally recognized. However, it reinforces the claim of the Philippines in the South China Sea, and it's being used, of course, especially now by the Philippine government under Marcos Jr. to rally international support as well, especially from the West, like the United States, UK, France, and the Western Alliance. And in some ways, these Western countries are trying to put some kind of, or having this rhetorical agreement or acceptance of the term WPS. However, sometimes also they use it simultaneously, South China Sea and WPS, when they address in the international community, these Western countries like Hegseth. Hegseth, when he visited the Philippines last, I think March, if I'm not mistaken, he used the word South China Sea, not WPS. So, but in another occasion, he used WPS or South China Sea. So you can see sometimes there's ambiguity in many ways. So, but when you talk about the International Hydrographic Organization, I don't think WPS is recognized by this organization, which is also an observer, has a United Nations observer status, and it's more in charge in mapping the world and producing some kind of maps that is internationally recognized. Thus far, this organization does not recognize WPS. So if you really look at it in a totality, I think both the domestic audience, Filipinos, and even the international community should not have a confusion between domestic policy and international law. The Philippines uses WPS domestically, but its legal weight, or its technically speaking, its validity or its legality or legitimacy is just within the jurisdiction of the Philippines. It is mainly used for political and strategic and geopolitical purposes, particularly in asserting Philippine claims in the South China Sea. However, when you talk about international community, and when you talk about international law, and even when you talk about if in any case WPS is recognized by other claimant states, like for example Malaysia, Brunei, China, and even Vietnam, I don't think they recognize the term WPS. That's one thing I know. Now, on the other hand, WPS, to a certain extent, appears in Google Maps. Sometimes it appears in Google Maps, sometimes it does not appear in Google Maps. But the question is, would it mean that just because it appears in Google Map, it is already internationally recognized? I don't think so. I really don't think so. So that is my answer to the question. If in any case, Western Maps or Google Maps put WPS in there, if has legitimacy or it is already recognized by the international community, I don't think so. It's not equatable, because I think a term like WPS would only be recognized by the international community if it goes through the legal proceeding of an application in the UN system, or maybe if it would be part of an international, if it's part of international law. But as far as of now, there's no such thing. So that's my explanation.
Thank you. Well, I want to talk about, escalation in the South China Sea and the Philippines. We are on the heels of two back-to-back sets of military exercises hosted by the Philippines and conducted in conjunction with the U.S. They just kicked off Kamandag 9 last Monday, May 26th. These are joint military exercises that the Philippines and the U.S. Host in the Philippines along with Japan, South Korea, and UK forces. These come immediately after the conclusion of Balikatan, which are war drills that the Philippines hosted with around 14,000 soldiers, mostly from the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific Command, along with hundreds of others from U.S. allies. So these are two back-to-back military exercises in just 1 month in the Philippines. And as part of these war drills, military forces deploy advanced missile systems in strategic Philippine island chains, just a few hundred miles from Taiwan, so right on China's doorstep. Can you talk a little bit more about these drills, how they represent a dangerous escalation in the region, and, what role does the Philippines serve in U.S. containment strategy of China?
Okay. This back-to-back military exercise, like the Balikatan and the Kamandag 9, underscore Philippines' some kind of deepening entrenchment in Washington Indo-Pacific strategy, which is basically a containment strategy against China. If anyone is familiar about the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States, which actually started from Trump, the first presidency of Trump, then continued during the time of Biden. But now I think because of the Trump 2.0, I think it still will be very relevant. The basic premise of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States is really a containment strategy against China. So I think this Balikatan and back-to-back military exercises between the Philippines and the United States and other other participants coming from the Western Alliance, and you have also Japan, and you have South Korea being part of it as observers, not necessarily as participants in the drills, in the exercises, is within. It's like aligning. The Philippines is aligning itself and deeply aligning itself and more involved in Washington Indo-Pacific strategy. If you ask me if what is this all about and what's the danger of this, I think this is dangerous because it provokes it's like an acceleration of militarization of the region through militarizing the Philippines, because it's really the Philippines that is being militarized at the moment by the United States. So, and also this military exercises, back-to-back military exercises and deployment of 14,000 troops coming from the United States and also on our side. And I think, and you have also other players in there like UK and even Japan, South Korea. This is provocative and escalatory because of the proximity of the exercises, which is very much near to Taiwan Strait. And Taiwan Strait, as we know, is a very volatile region. And when you talk about the Taiwan Strait, you cannot distinguish or you cannot separate China out of this issue because it's quite related. So, and also the proximity to the South China Sea area. And Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, if you look at Asia Pacific, these are two of the very sensitive and volatile flashpoints in the Asia Pacific region. So these military drills are being conducted near these areas, near this flashpoint. So it's, as far as China is concerned, this is very provocative, and as far as the region is concerned, this is some kind of escalatory moves coming from the Philippines and also from the United States. So actually, this is not good for, as far as I'm concerned. This provoke more tension, and I think even arms race in the region, because as you can see, the Balikatan Earth exercises and the Kamandag 9, it's not just about practicing military. It's not about Earth exercise militarily speaking. It's also about deployments of high level weapons coming from the United States. Like, for example, as far as I know, there were deployment of Nemesis missile system. The Typhoon missile system is already in the Philippines, and it's deployed in the northern part of the Philippines. And the deployment is again facing Taiwan and even facing the South China Sea. So this is very provocative as far as China is concerned. So this is not good for the region. This makes the region more volatile and hot for any kind of military miscalculation on the ground. So I don't think this is a good news for anyone in even in the Philippines, as far as Filipinos are concerned. So this is the situation at the moment. And also, if you look at the Philippines, given all of this military exercises and deployment of high-end military assets to the country by the United States, the Philippines becomes a frontline state. Because the Philippines, actually, if you really look at it, it's a buffer state of the United States. However, right now, if this militarization of the Philippines by the United States, it becomes a frontline state from being a buffer state because of the presence, first and foremost, of EDCA sites. And 5 of that EDCA sites are strategically located near Taiwan and the South China Sea. And again, the deployment of high-level military assets of the United States. So now it's not, the country is not anymore just a buffer state, but it's like a frontline state of the United States. And hopefully it will not be a proxy state in any kind of proxy war that might happen in any of the 2 flashpoints in Asia Pacific, and that would be the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, or both. That is my worry as a Filipino, I think. So this, in a way, what happens to the United States, it's not anymore a neutral party or a buffer. It becomes a combat adjacent territory, increasing the risk of direct retaliation with China in a Taiwan contingency or a South China Sea escalation. And when you talk about risk, I'm talking about military conflict. So that is the problem of having the Philippines, a Philippine government too much on military and defense rather than probably on economics or development. Because, as a country, it has an option of, rather than deepening military and defense relationship with the United States, probably it should talk more about economics and development, that the United States, that the US can possibly help Philippines, especially now that it's also facing a lot of economic problems and challenges in, under a Marcos Jr. administration. Now, in terms of implication of all this, the Philippine sovereignty is compromised, and the country risks becoming a collateral damage in a US-China conflict. If in any case, God forbid, that will never happen. Worst of all, the illusion of a joint commands, because this military exercises, they always have this joint command, joint military exercises. But if you really look at it, there's such a thing as asymmetric military alliance, because we are a treaty ally of the United States through the MDT, the Mutual Defense Treaty. But this the military alliance between these 2 countries is very asymmetric. I think it has more advantage for the United States, and usually strategic decisions are made in Washington, not in Manila. That's what I know. So yeah. So Yeah, that is a very this military exercises, to be frank with you, is very risky for the Philippines. It's not good for the region. It provokes an arms race. It provokes tension more, especially China. And China reacts to it actually by also staging their own military exercises near in their territorial waters, and even a lot of military exercises near Taiwan. So the whole region becomes a very tension driven, and I don't think ASEAN countries or even other countries in Asia Pacific likes they don't like this atmosphere. And as much as possible, what other countries in ASEAN, like for example Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and even Vietnam, they want to de-escalate this kind of tension, especially military tensions, because as far as we are concerned in our region, we want to talk more about economic prosperity and development and less more about military and defense. But what is happening through the Philippines and with this escalated kind of military exercises between the two countries, I mean, other players, other regional countries are too anxious right now, and really like uncomfortable with all of these things, because as far as the region is concerned, especially ASEAN countries, except for the Philippines, really, the foreign policy of other ASEAN countries are independent and neutral. It's just unfortunate that under a Marcos Jr. government, our foreign policy is very much leaning to the United States. And that is not just the case. Our foreign policy are very much militarized and heavily influenced as well by the United States. So this makes things a little bit uncomfortable, I think, with other ASEAN countries, because as much as possible, countries in the region, they don't want to choose between China and the United States. They want to assert what you call ASEAN centrality when you talk about regional security concern. But if you have the presence of the United States becoming more prominent and huge, especially military presence in the region, this kind of challenge, this actually challenge the what you call ASEAN centrality, and it kind of alter the security architecture supposedly that is more peaceful, more neutral, more non-militarized in the region. So this is my perspective when you talk about this high level escalated military exercises between the United States and also of the Philippines, including the fact that deployment of high level military assets actually is happening in the Philippines, not only during the time of military exercises, I think, but I think it happens through different agreements. Like there's a rotational deployment of American troops. There's an upgrading of EDCA sites, and EDCA sites are basically U.S. military bases in the Philippines. So this is not really a comfortable reality at the moment, and many Filipinos are very much afraid that the country again is a pawn or a proxy of the United States, especially with its strategic and rivalry and competition with China in the Asia Pacific region. So yeah.
Well, given all this, I want to talk about a few recent comments by Philippine government officials. Last week, China, ASEAN countries, and the Gulf Cooperation Council, they met in Kuala Lumpur for their first ever trilateral summit to discuss, economic cooperation and strengthen ties. But at this summit, Philippine Foreign Affairs Secretary Enrique Manalo promised that the Philippines is willing to explore any additional agreements with Beijing that can help maintain peace in the South China Sea. And President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. also called for the acceleration of adopting a legally binding code of conduct to de-escalate tensions and prevent eruption of a major conflict. So considering the conduction of these military exercises that you just discussed, a recent editorial in the Global Times, which is a state publication in China, they accused Manila of, and this is a quote, showcasing its two-faced strategy of saying one thing and doing another. So how do you make sense of the Philippine government's statements of wanting to move toward peace and stability in the South China Sea, while at the same time coming off the heels of these two sets of back-to-back military exercises? What do you think is the strategy of the Philippine government here?
Actually, I have the same kind of criticism with reference to the Marcos Jr. administration, especially when he said, especially with when it comes to the statements and the actions on the ground. In most cases, this is not only very evident when you talk about geopolitical issues like the South China Sea. It's also evident in the domestic politics inside the country. So it's really a criticism at the moment. Not only it's not only my criticism, but actually other Filipinos are very critical or are critic of the current administration of Marcos Jr. is always it's always like this. Marcos Jr. will say something, and the state will say something in any gathering for that matter. But on the other hand, the action does not coincide with the statement. That is a prevalent kind of I don't know if it's really a strategy, but I think it's more like what you call incoherence of the Marcos Jr.'s administration when you especially when you talk about critical issues. So sometimes, and most often than not, he will say something, but he will do the other thing, or he will not necessarily fulfill what he have said, and but would rather do something opposite to what he have said. So that pretty much quite consistent, even in domestic affairs or domestic policy or domestic issues. And that is one of the very evident criticism against Marcos Jr. and his administration. So, but when you talk about the South China Sea issue, actually, I made a very good comment in my social media account in Facebook saying that I commend actually President Marcos Jr. during the ASEAN summit, where he said that he would want to see a code of conduct in the South China Sea concluded, and should be a binding mechanism that would be between ASEAN member states and, of course, China. So I said, okay, that is a very good statement, I think, because the code of conduct in the South China Sea is very important. And next year, 2026, the Philippines will be the chairman of ASEAN, because it's a rotating thing. Now it's Malaysia. Next year, I think it's the Philippines, because Myanmar cannot take the chairmanship precisely because of its internal issues. So the Philippines will be the chairman in 2026. So with this statement, I said President Marcos Jr. could possibly have a follow-through of this kind of statement when the Philippines assume chairmanship in 2026. And then hopefully during that time, we will have a legally binding code of conduct in the South China Sea. But on the other hand, I also have a caution in my statement saying that I hope that this is not a lip service, precisely because what we experience even in domestic affairs is he says one thing, but he does another thing. So I was cautioning my readers that, let's manage our expectation, because maybe this is a lip service, but I would want to be proven wrong by the president that he will do really, and he will push for the conclusion of the COC when the time that the Philippines will be the chairman of ASEAN next year. Because to be very frank, with this kind of attitude, or kind of what, I don't know if it's a strategy really of the Marcos administration, this is basically what you call strategic incoherence. And it's not really good to be perceived with this kind of strategic incoherence by many countries, because it will lead to credibility erosion. I mean, the eradication, or, the credibility of the Philippines as a state, especially in the international level and the international community, will be eroded. And it will also create ASEAN tension. And also, countries in ASEAN, even beyond ASEAN, will lose trust. They will not trust anymore the Philippines because, they are not true to their words. And so I hope really that whatever Marcos Jr. have said in the ASEAN summit, probably he should do something really and put it into action, not just statements, because statement is nothing without action, especially if you're a leader of a country and you're part of a intergovernmental organization like ASEAN, and you have said this in that context. So that is my opinion, and that is actually my hope that he will, for the first time, or maybe for the first time, he will really follow through with his statement and would, something will happen out of it. So that is the case, because for me, really, international trust of other countries is important, because if other countries will not trust the Philippines anymore, then it will affect how we relate with other countries. It will affect with our economic, relationship in terms of treaties and signing documents, agreements, or a lot of these things. So so the bottom line is that Manila should not play a game of mixed signals because of saying one thing but doing the other, because this approach, in many ways, is not sustainable in the long run, even in the short term. Without a clear and coherent and independent foreign policy anchored, well, based on regional trust and the trust of other countries in the region, Manila will be perceived as, as just, a toy or a pawn by its so-called big brother, the United States, that it doesn't have, its own, how do you call that? Its own
foreign
stand.
policy.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a foreign policy, but it's more about its own path to follow that is independent from its so-called big brother, the United States. And in a way, by being consistent in what you say and what you do, you will gain the trust and I think the respect of other countries, which at the moment, to be frank with you, among ASEAN countries, the Philippines is losing that sense of credibility, that the trust of its counterparts in ASEAN and even of other countries. I think the Philippines is having a crisis on that. So because of the mismanagement and also because of this incoherence that is very much evident in Marcos Jr. administration. Yeah.
Well, you argued that the Philippines is being used as a geopolitical pawn by the United States, particularly against China. And for viewers who may not necessarily be so familiar with the history of your country, can you put what's happening now in the larger context of the colonial relationship that the U.S. has had with the Philippines? And do you see this current state of affairs of U.S.-Philippine relations as an extension of that history?
Okay. Let's talk about a little of historical context, and then we'll proceed to your question. Yeah, to understand the Philippine current role in the U.S. strategy, particularly positioning in the so-called China-U.S. rivalry, it is essential to see and revisit the colonial roots of U.S.-Philippine relation, because what we're witnessing today is not a break from history, but a continuation of it in a more sophisticated and arguably not so good way, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm a Filipino. Because we don't have any, as far as I'm concerned, our experience with the Americans are, well, there are good things during the colonial times, but most of it also are bad, and because of the United States colonizing us until now, it's like still a semi-colonial state. So the Philippines, as you can see, was a colonial state or a colony of the United States. But during 1946, I think it was given so-called nominal independence, but still the presence of U.S. military bases in the country was very, very evident. And during the Cold War, the Philippines was again a strategic outpost and hosting large military bases in the country and even naval base in Subic and actually in Clark Air Base. So this installation were symbolic and they were operationalized in the Philippines as a forward base of US power projection in Asia. And the question is if it's changed now or it's still the same. And US military presence also in the Philippines shaped foreign policy choices, making it difficult for us to truly be an independent state. And even until now, you can see that Philippine foreign policy, even at this time, especially under a Marcos government, is very much influenced and heavily, heavily influenced by the United States. So now the question is, how can we, is it true that um our Filipinos or the Philippines already had a break from that kind of the colonial past, especially under and being a colony of the United States? Thus far, as far as I'm concerned, no. Still, the pattern of during that time until now is still very much apparent in today's context. At the moment, the Philippines is being militarized, not for its own defense, but for US strategy against China, or what you call US containment strategy against China. So we're being militarized. Before, in history during the Cold War, we were also being used as an outpost of the United States against what you call communist Russia and communist China. So and now it's still the same. It's not changed, but this is more now about trying to contain China's rise in Asia Pacific and in the world. So we're being militarized because of that. It's not for our defense, but basically it serves the US strategic interest in the Asia Pacific region, or what you call Indo-Pacific region. Now, the joint military drills, military placement, and access to our military bases on the northern and western Philippines, and of course the installation of the 9 EDCA bases, all of this serves the Indo-Pacific containment architecture of the United States vis-a-vis China. And the Philippines is what? We are, again, still the longest outpost of the United States in Asia Pacific. And it did not change thus far since since colonial times until now. So there's not much difference really. And, President Marcos Jr. pivot to Washington while framed as defensive sovereignty ironically compromises the sovereignty by outsourcing our security to a foreign power like the United States, which has its own agenda. And now the United States is using the Philippines as a platform for power projection, and with a potential conflict with China over Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. So the thing here is we are still in we still as a country we still have this colonial flag, and we're still actually being perceived even by many countries as a semi-colonial state of the United States. But we have still our old master, our colonial master. But at this time, there's a new playbook, and there's a new target, and that's China. So this is really the reality of the Philippines at the moment. So if you ask me if there's a change, a substantial change from our experience during the colonial times under the United States and now, maybe the world becomes modern, but substantially speaking, the Philippines is still very much under the hands and the control of the United States. Not necessarily direct control or direct administration, but probably in terms of influence when it comes to its foreign policy, when it comes to its defense, and when it comes to being kind of a pawn in the grand scheme of geopolitical competition between China and the United States. So we're still there. We're still not able to get out of that kind of situation. And I feel sad that this is our situation, to be frank with you, because as a country, I think in ASEAN countries, if you really look at ASEAN countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, most of these countries are all, in many ways, they also experience colonialism. They were also under the colonial rule of some Western countries, especially European countries, like Vietnam was under France, I think. And but if you look at them, and Indonesia were under the Dutch colonial masters. But if you look at them right now, they're pursuing an independent foreign policy. They're neutral. They determine their path as a nation state and what they're going to do without the interference and heavy influence coming from outside forces. But it seems that the Philippines is still not able to get out of that kind of situation at the moment. It's still under the some kind of heavy influence of the United States, especially on defense and military and foreign policy. So no doubt, if the Philippines continue this trajectory, it risks reliving its colonial past under the guise of partnership with the United States. The challenge really for the country at the moment is, can it really be independent in the true sense of being an independent state or independent country, or would it continue to be an outpost of the United States in its power projection in the Asia Pacific, and it would be the pawn of the United States in its geopolitical and strategic competition with China in Asia Pacific? So that's actually the challenge and the question for Filipinos at the moment, because at the end of the day, it's in the hands of the Filipino people how they gonna determine the path of their own country and where they want to go and what kind of country do you really want. You want a country that is dependent, then you have to do something. Or if you want a country to be continuously under the heavy influence of the United States and to a semi-colonial control of the United States, then it's in the hands really of the Filipino people. So, but for me as an analyst, I still see it that we're still, we really were not able to get out of our colonial past, or had to a certain extent at least have a break with that kind of experience during the colonial times. We're still, I feel, a semi-colonial country of the United States in many ways. Not necessarily direct subjugation, but influence, I think, is very heavy, especially in this current administration of Marcos Jr.
Well, Anna Malindog-Uy, we really appreciate your insights today and really appreciate you giving us time on the China Report. Maybe for viewers who are interested in checking out more of your work, is there a place where they can find it?
I have a website, a head site. It's called Head Site. I think. Yeah, and also I write for Manila Times every Saturday. I publish my articles every Saturday, so they can check it out. And also, I think I have Substack. Some of my articles I posted in Substacks too.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Anna.
Yeah, X and on Facebook.
Thank you so much.
X is very popular in the United States, no? Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, the Dragon Boat Festival kicked off this past weekend in China. According to Chinese popular folklore, beloved Chinese poet Chu Yun died by suicide by throwing himself into a river. Immediately after learning of Chu's death, the locals in the village raced out in boats to search for his body. This then evolved into dragon boat races we see today as a tribute to the poet's legacy. This video comes from Fujian province, where the tradition is racing dragon boats at night. And we hope you enjoy this video of this year's festivities. And as a reminder, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this week's episode. We'll see you next week on the China Report.